Welcome to the podcast. We're going to do things a little bit differently for this episode. Last year, during the national lockdown of 2020, which was also the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower, I was due to be part of an exhibition called Beyond the Mayflower at the Western Gallery at the University of Nottingham. That was postponed and then postponed for a second time, but I'm pleased to say that it's been rescheduled and due to open on the 23rd of September 2021 and will run all the way through till the 16th of January 2022. It's a great exhibition. I do urge you to go along and have a look at some of the amazing things that they've got. I'm also going to be giving a talk at the university on the 14th of October, and it will be live streamed. And you can find out lots more about the exhibition and the talk by popping on my website and clicking the events page. So for the rest of this episode, we're going to look back at my conversation with Kathryn Summerwill from the Manuscripts department and hear all about the court summons of William Brewster, Thomas Helwys of Broxtowe, and the problems that they encountered by preaching in secret. Enjoy. So today's podcast is all about a forthcoming exhibition. It's titled Beyond the Mayflower 1620-2020, and it's going to be held at the Lakeside Gallery at the University of Nottingham. And the exhibition will look at how, amongst the Mayflower passengers, there was a group of religious separatists known as the Pilgrims, and many of them came from Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire and South Yorkshire. The exhibition will explore how we can understand those individuals by tracing the history of religious dissent in Nottinghamshire and examining how the faith of those individuals and communities was controlled and monitored by the Crown. The history of dissent, power and faith in the county during the 17th century and in later periods can be found in the records of the Archdeaconry of Nottingham, which is held at the Manuscripts and Special Collections Department. And these include documents of reports on parishioners who were thought by the Church of England to have departed from proper religious practice, including the Pilgrim Father William Brewster. And my special guest here to talk all about Beyond the Mayflower is Kathryn Summerwill from the Manuscripts and Special Collections at the University of Nottingham. Welcome to the podcast, Kathryn.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Well, it sounds such an amazing exhibition, and I'm really honoured to be asked to be part of this exhibition, and I'll be providing some items from my Spirit of Mayflower project. But
Yes.
Let's dive straight in. Tell us what have you got about Brewster and Bradford?
Yeah, so we're really lucky to hold the archive of the historic Archdeaconry of Nottingham. The Archdeaconry Court was well known in the 18th century under the name of the Bawdy Court. This was because there was a perceived focus on moral misdemeanours. The church was like a parallel legal organisation that made reports on and brought people to court for a number of different things that the church had jurisdiction over. This ran in parallel to the civil law courts that we're a bit more familiar about.
Right.
So yes, there was a focus on moral misdemeanours. So people were brought to the court for having children out of wedlock or committing adultery, for instance. And that's the kind of the headline news and what a lot of people think about if they think about the Archdeaconry Court. But in its heyday, from the late 16th century to around about the period of the English Civil War and a little bit after, the Archdeaconry Court had a lot of jurisdiction over people's religious life. So in the very early years of the 17th century, everybody was supposed to go to their local Anglican parish church. There was just one church, the Church of England, its bishops and its archdeacons monitored people going to church.
Right.
And this is where we get references to some of the people who later became pilgrims. So, for instance, there is only one reference to William Brewster of Scrooby in the Archdeaconry church records. So there's a presentment bill. This was a piece of paper that was made up and signed by the vicar and the church wardens. And this happened in every parish twice a year. All of the church wardens had to make a report on their neighbours, detailing what they had done wrong in the context of the things that the church had jurisdiction over.
Like snitching on all the neighbours.
Yes, very much snitching on the neighbours. So the church wardens in Scrooby on the 27th of April 1598 reported that William Brewster had been repeating sermons publicly in the church without authority. So the only people supposed to preach in churches were licensed preachers.
Yeah.
But William Brewster had been repeating sermons publicly in the church without authority. And also, he and his wife isn't named by name, just Mrs. Brewster, and some other neighbours were also reported for resorting to other churches in sermon time. So not only did you have to attend an Anglican church service every Sunday, and you had to take communion at Easter, it had to be in your own parish church. So this was a method of controlling who was preaching and where, so what people were listening to. So William Brewster and a certain number of other people had gone to another church. So that was the Churchwarden Presentment Bill. After the Presentment Bill was brought into the Archdeacon's Court, the judge of the court decided if any cases should proceed.
Right.
And any cases that did proceed were written up in act books. And we have the full sequence of act books from the Archdeaconry of Nottingham. And they're pretty difficult to use because they used a lot of Latin, and they abbreviated words very heavily. So it's all quite formulaic. And sometimes a case just disappears. It wasn't taken any further, so it wasn't written down. So quite often you don't get the kind of end story. But in this instance, there's a reference in the Act Book to say that William Brewster and the other neighbours explained in court that they were trying to save a little bit of money, and they maintained one preacher who preached in Scrooby, where they lived, and also in Bawtry. And so what they were explaining was that the preacher did sort of alternate shifts in Scrooby and Bawtry. And so when the preacher wasn't in Scrooby, he was in Bawtry, and the congregation went there to listen to him. So that was their excuse, their explanation of why they were going to Bawtry to listen to this preacher.
That's a very, very clever, isn't it, really, of Brewster?
They sort of got away with it. They were dismissed. So the case was dismissed, but it was dismissed with admonition. So there would have been perhaps a little bit of a fine. But that's the end of the story, actually, when it comes to the Archdeaconry records of William Brewster. The reason for that is that the Archdeaconry Court had a certain amount of jurisdiction over what was going on in the county. But when things got a little bit more serious later on, when Scrooby became the headquarters of a separatist church in William Brewster's house, it was actually a higher authority that sort of finally took charge of that. So in 1607, there was a crackdown on the church in Scrooby, and also on John Smith's church in Gainsborough. But that crackdown was undertaken by the Archbishop of York. so it was at a higher level. So we don't have the records there in the Archdeaconry Court, but we're aware that there are some records for the province of York that are at the Borthwick Institute. So we kind of get the first part of the story, just these little names coming in of people who kind of subsequently became famous for being separatists.
So, what this crackdown on the on Brewster and his neighbours, what kind of form would that have taken? Would have been sort of a military force, or would it have been sort of more court dates? What kind of things would have happened?
Yeah, I think I understand that it would have been court dates. You can kind of see it slightly ramping up in the Archdeaconry records. So, for instance, in 1605, we've got a presentment bill for Sturton Le Steeple, which is another village in the north of Nottinghamshire. John Robinson was reported to have preached at Sturton Le Steeple on Whit Sunday 1605, and 17 people from neighbouring parishes all around admitted that they had been there instead of in their own churches.
Right.
So this is a similar thing, that they've been presented for not being where they should have been, listening to other preachers.
Right. And would they have, sorry to interrupt, I just wondered if the names of those 17 people were recorded, or whether it was just a congregation of 17.
No, they were. I think we've got the record of those 17 people. I haven't got it to hand, I'm afraid, but that's in the Archdeaconry records. And then the other records that we have, kind of leading up to the exile, are relating to Thomas Helwys of Broxtowe. So he was a man who lived in the south of the county. Broxtowe's a suburb of Nottingham now. He was a supporter of John Smith's church in Gainsborough, and he sort of ran a kind of centre of separatism down in the south of Nottinghamshire. So on the 15th of May 1607, we have a presentment bill for the parish of Bilborough. That's where he lived.
Yeah.
And he and his wife and his servants, very similar thing, they were presented for not receiving Holy Communion in their parish church. And then the next year, they were presented for a similar offence, but in the neighbouring parish of Baseford. So that's in May 1608. But that's a bit curious, because according to some other records, by 1608, Thomas Helwys had actually already fled. He'd fled to Amsterdam, as did William Brewster and William Bradford and the congregation from Scrooby. And they fled because they were facing action by the authorities at York. So yes, they would have been summoned to court. They would have felt quite fearful that if they had been taken to court, they could have been imprisoned and they could have been fined a lot of money. So they left before those actions could have been taken.
Yeah, so I suppose it's very similar to today's court summons, where you're maybe sent a letter and then you have time to actually go there. Maybe that letter was issued, but too late. He was already gone. He was on the boat over to the Netherlands.
Yes, that's right.
So
that's right.
Didn't show up to his court dates.
No, that's right. And then of course they disappear from our records, here, apart from what was written afterwards, the memories of the people that were there.
Gosh, it's fascinating, because that's something new. I've been reading about the separatists for some time now during this project, and I always believed that the activities of the separatists were in the north of Nottinghamshire, and I live in Broxtowe in the south of the county, and I never knew there was stuff happening here.
So Thomas Helwys was a really important figure in the separatist movement. So he went to Amsterdam at the same time and moved on to Leiden at the same time as the others. But then I think there was a bit of a falling out, and his beliefs went in a slightly different direction. He actually came back to London a few years later, where he was imprisoned, and he died in prison. But he is considered as the founder of the Baptist Church. So it's a slightly different set of beliefs than the ones who went on to America in the Mayflower. So yeah, they'd sort of diverged at that point. So yes, Thomas Helwys. But curiously, in the Archdeaconry records that we have of him, he's given a slightly different name. He's actually been called Mr. Thomas Elvish,
Right.
Elvshe, which is quite different from the name that he's known as now, Helwys, Helwys. So you could kind of skip past that reference without realizing that it's actually the same man. So yeah, 17th century handwriting and spelling can be a little bit of a challenge when you're researching this kind of material. It's a bit different
Yeah.
from nowadays.
Well, I think one of my own ancestors spring to mind, and I think it was only about just over 100 years ago. He obviously couldn't, he wasn't literate, but
Yeah.
he lived in an area called Horsley Woodhouse.
Mm.
And he said to the scribe who would come to the door to take the census, where are you from? And with his thick Derbyshire accent, Osley, because as many people may know of Derbyshire, that often the H's are dropped. And
Yes.
the scribe wrote Ostley, Yorkshire,
Ostley, yes. Imagine it. Yes, it was somewhere else.
because
Yeah,
he
whereas he,
couldn't
of course,
understand his local
no.
dialect, and he couldn't
Yeah,
correct the scribe for writing it down wrong.
no.
Actually, no, I'm from Horsley Woodhouse, because he said I'm from Ostley.
That's exactly what he heard. Yes.
So it is I suppose difficult when you're looking at historical documents. Sometimes you have got to unpick and sort of
Yes.
come away from them and come at them in a different angle.
Yeah. That's certainly the case. And John Smith appears in the records as the spelling Y with maybe an E at the end, and sometimes a different spelling. And the name John Smith is quite common as well. So sometimes you're not quite sure whether is this really the John Smith that I'm reading about, or is it somebody else? And yeah, there's a certain element of just trying to figure out, is he doing the kind of thing I would expect him to do in the kind of region? And you're thinking, yes, this probably is the man, and he's described as a preacher, so it's probably the same John Smith. But yes, we're working with just sort of tiny little pieces of evidence.
So let's continue, Kathryn.
So the exhibition will go a little bit beyond that, these tales of sort of how the pilgrims came about, and look also at the myths of the Mayflower and how people have been remembering the Mayflower, how people are remembering the Mayflower this year.
Yeah.
So we're part of the University of Nottingham Library, and we have a really good selection of older printed books. So we have some 17th, 18th and 19th century editions of Bradford's history of the Plymouth settlement and other histories that were written sort of remembering the pilgrims.
Right. Oh, that's such a fascinating book as well. I read that while I was crossing the Atlantic to give sort of a flavour of that time as I was travelling the Atlantic.
Fascinating reading it as you were actually doing that journey. Yeah, so that's the bit that our archive collections lack, is that story of sort of what happened afterwards. But what we do have are records of how people have remembered the Mayflower, particularly the 300th anniversary, the tercentenary in 1920. We've got quite a lot of material of how people commemorated the Mayflower 100 years ago.
Right.
And of course, maybe as you'd expect, those memories of the Mayflower and what people thought about the Mayflower 100 years ago are very Eurocentric. They're very about how people traveled to America and made that life there, and how their religious freedom was important to them.
Yes.
And they definitely lack the point of view of the Wampanoag people whose land they were actually settling. So this is a really good opportunity, as many people are doing this year, to try and bring in those other stories, which is why working with you is going to be so amazing, because you've got an artistic perspective on it, and that history, that you've actually done that travel yourself, and then made this amazing sculpture of the Pilgrim Woman.
Yeah, I was so honoured to be able to go and see in person some of the actual artifacts made by people of the First Nations. And one of my first stops when I'd finally landed in the United States after traveling the Atlantic was a short visit to Harvard University. And there I spent time with Meredith Vaster, and she's the collection steward at the Peabody Museum. And she'd put together a collection of pieces that she thought I'd be interested in, because before I'd set sail, I spent a couple of months as artist in residence at Nottingham's Industrial Museum, surrounded by lace making machines, framework knitting machines, all things that my ancestors would have been very familiar with, because a lot of them worked in Nottingham's textile industries. And I was looking at the patterns that were created within Nottingham lace, but was interested to see the perspective from the First Nations. So Meredith had put together all of these artifacts in the viewing room, and I had to don my white coat and go in this special room. I wasn't allowed to touch, but I was given so much time to just sit and record them and sketch them. And there was pieces from the Iroquois, from the Akina. There was, some amazingly complex pieces of quill work and beadwork. And for an artist to get to see sort of two different influences from either side of the Atlantic and then put that together, those inspirations within my sculpture, it was just quite an incredible journey. And I'm so thankful that it actually happened, because if it was scheduled for this year,
it would all have been different.
It would have been. So I'm going to bring along to the exhibition 5 sketches that I made during my time at Harvard, but I've also got a few other little bits and pieces that are going to be in the exhibition. So I'm really looking forward to be able to put these on display alongside some of the manuscripts, and I can't wait to see them in person.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it as well. Yeah, and it's the sculpture of the Pilgrim Woman is also just lovely for us, because, as I said before, William Brewster's wife Mary, when she was presented in Scrooby, she wasn't given a name. It was just William Brewster and his wife.
Yeah.
So that's the other part that's lacking in the contemporary historical records is any sense of how the women and the children fitted into the story.
Well, yeah, and there were so many of them on the boat, wasn't there? I think, and it was quite a range of passengers, and I suppose a lot of people, when they think Pilgrim Fathers, they have this picture in their mind of that maybe is not quite true. It's it was a lot of young families, wasn't it, crossing the Atlantic. And certainly for myself, when I've been researching, it's very hard to find sources of information about your female ancestors unless they have been a bit naughty and
in their own right, rather than along with their husband.
Exactly, yes.
We have a lot more records about women in later nonconformist congregations at the university. So some of the other things that we'll be displaying are records from High Pavements and Castlegate churches in Nottingham. So they were congregations, nonconformist congregations that were allowed to form during the period of the English Civil War, when the bishops were abolished, and they officially sort of look back to 1662 as their foundation year, we have records of those congregations up to the 20th century, and you find a lot of women taking part in Sunday school teaching, they're mentioned in sort of church magazines, that kind of thing. So the records get much richer as they move forwards in time. But back in the 17th century, there's very little.
Yeah. So it's for me, it was important. I try to tease out that story of the women and and showcase that side of history, and also with being a female sculptor in a very male-dominated world, it's important for me to show sort of the female side, but also, you know, to be able to create a statue of a woman. You know, there's not that many of them, you know, so it makes me feel good that I'm doing something, or it feels like I'm doing something important with this art piece. So hopefully it'll be well accepted, and people will enjoy going to see it. So I can't wait to get them in situ.
Yes, it's been a long time waiting to actually get this exhibition together, so it will be great when it does happen.
Well, thank you again, Kathryn, for being part of the Spirit of Mayflower podcast.
No problem. It's nice to talk to you.
Spirit of Mayflower is part of a series celebrating my Spirit of Mayflower project. You can get involved in lots of ways. You can take a look at some of the movies and pictures I took on my journey by heading to the Rachel Carter Sculpture Facebook page. You can also head to my website at www.rachelcarter.co.uk, and there you'll be able to view some of the sculptures I make, treat yourself to a limited edition Pilgrim Woman sculpture, or take a look at some of the online tutorials.
On the tide, with a cargo full of hopes and dreams and 100 souls inside, we're crossing the great ocean, we're riding on the tide, with a cargo full of hopes and dreams.